Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I would like to first of all welcome all young students who are so eager to know about some difficult subject. But I like to make this difficult subject, if possible, interesting. We all know that the denuclearization is a prerequisite to the establishment of a peace regime of the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. And vice versa is also true to the same extent. It means that the process of denuclearization and establishment of peace regime on the peninsula are achievable only when the two tracks move in tandem. To make it possible, we need to have a shared vision of a future Korean Peninsula. Korean Peninsula without a nuclear weapon. And Korean Peninsula that is acceptable to the two Koreas as well as other countries related. If not, denuclearization efforts by different governments will ever remain in the realm of show, not in substance. Actually, with that understanding in mind, the 6 parties, South, North, United States, China, Russia, and Japan, in September 2005 in Beijing, reached a joint statement comprising first denuclearization and normalization of relations among countries, and economic cooperation, and peace regime of Korean Peninsula, and security cooperation in Northeast Asia. Were it implemented, security environment in Northeast Asia now must have improved dramatically. Unfortunately, last 14 years have witnessed the danger of nuclear proliferation in the region is looming larger with the emergence of North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state. Now even talks about a new nuclear balance do not sound unusual. Today, in this session, we are going to discuss the ways to move ahead in the 2 tracks of denuclearization and establishment of peace regime. I wish today's discussion produces concrete ideas and suggestions. Panels here are all experts, well known to be best equipped with knowledge and wisdom to handle this task. Even though they may not represent their government's views, they are regarded to be in full grasp of the perspectives of respective countries. In the first round of this discussion, each panel has 6 minutes to present his view, and will be given another 3 minutes in the follow-up discussion. I'd like to propose first start with Minister Gareth Evans, and then in the same order of seating. Minister Gareth Evans is the internationally known expert on international relations and also denuclearization and non-proliferation. And his view, I suggest him to present first because he is somewhat a little distant. Australia, a little distant from Korean Peninsula, can give some objective. I'm not going to, others are not objective, but some more objective views first, and then we'll go ahead with in the order of the panels. And after that, the second round of discussions, I will give some time to have question and answers among panels. And later we will open the discussion to the floor. So let me start. Let me ask Garrett, please.
Well, thank you very much, Min Soon. I will leave it to others to say a little bit more, as they undoubtedly will, about the particular next steps in the denuclearization negotiation process. What I want to concentrate on is the two basic general conditions which I think are necessary if we are ever to achieve a final successful outcome to the denuclearization negotiations, and also to have a more generally sustainable peace in the region as a whole. And those two preconditions are two conditions. First of all, a fundamental change in the mindset, the psychology of the key political players, and secondly, a set of institutional arrangements which will reinforce and consolidate a change of mindset and consolidate any peace deal that's formally agreed to on the peninsula. The mindset issue is often neglected, but is really very important. What I'm talking about is the overwhelming primary need for every relevant political leader in the region to bring to the geopolitics of East Asia a mindset which is focused not on confrontation and not on competition, but rather on cooperation. And to not just say it, but to actually believe it. What we're talking about is the absolute necessity of a cooperative security approach. Cooperative security is a fairly familiar phrase in the literature, and it's got a lot of different elements to it, but two in particular stand out. One component of it is the concept of common security, first articulated by the Olof Palme Commission many years ago. The idea that states best guarantee their security with each other rather than against each other. And the other crucial dimension of it is the idea of comprehensive security, that international security in the modern age is really multidimensional, demanding attention not just to political and diplomatic disputes, but to underlying economic and social issues. The message that we've been getting from all the key players, with the possible, and I think genuine exception of President Moon here in South Korea, is not really consistent with that particular mindset. And a lot of mindsets are going to have to change if the whole atmospheric of East Asia, Northeast Asia, is going to change. Let's look at it from the point of view of the different players. From the United States, for a start, right across the leadership spectrum, not just on the Republican side, not just in the Trump administration, but in the Democrats as well. There's simply going to have to be a psychological adjustment to the reality that the United States is no longer the world's sole superpower, that it will have to, for the foreseeable future, and play a role which recognises that it's not one of absolute primacy, not one of absolute dominance. That mindset is critical for the US to bring to all these negotiations, not just in the context of North Korea, but the larger geopolitics that are presently working themselves out. For China, similarly, although it's perfectly understandable that the new assertiveness we're seeing is a product of a century or more of wounded pride, humiliation, and a country reasserting its greatness. Nonetheless, what we are crying out for, I think, in the rest of the region, is a demonstration that the Chinese leadership means what it says when, for example, as Xi Jinping said in Australia a few years ago, back in 2014, he acknowledged the real dangers of China being seen as the big guy on the block who wants to push others around, stand in their way, even take their place. We need more of that language of recognition from China that it can't be seen and can't really play that role. And of course, we want behavior to match that language. In the case of Japan and South Korea themselves, I think there's a need for some national mindset adjustments. To be on the right side of history means escaping once and for all being prisoners of history. And I think you know here, much better than I could possibly comment from outside, how many issues, how many history issues are still capable of souring the bilateral relationship in particular between Japan and South Korea. Of course, the biggest mindset change of all we need is from North Korea itself, which has to overcome its paranoia about external and internal enemies that have so long consumed its leadership. But in encouraging the North Korean leadership to overcome that paranoia, I think we do have to recognise that North Korea is never going to put its regime survival at risk, and it's never going to be bludgeoned into submission by economic sanctions or by military threats. It really is only through, and I think the rest of us have to acknowledge this, through a step-by-step trust-building negotiation of the kind that President Moon Jae-in has been asserting and advocating. It's only that which has a chance of giving the DPRK real confidence that its national security and regime survival will be protected, that there's any chance, I think, of the present tensions being permanently and effectively diffused. But that is going to require not just a change of attitude on the part of the North Koreans, as I say, but others as well. The other side of the coin I want to emphasise as a necessary condition is a set of institutional changes and relationships, institutional changes which reinforce the kind of mindset we're talking about. Because these things do reinforce each other, just as institutional arrangements without the right psychology to go with them are not going to be guaranteed to be successful. So too, simply having psychological changes in the abstract without formal institutional underpinnings are themselves likely to be fairly empty. So there's three particular institutional changes I think are absolutely critical if we are going to consolidate any kind of peace process, any kind of denuclearization process in North Korea, and translate that into wider Northeast Asian security. The first institutional change, of course, is a new Korean peace treaty. The only way of bringing a formal end to the Korean War is to convert the 53 armistice into a binding peace treaty. There's a lot of arguments still about what's the best way or the possible way legally of doing that, but I think the most credible outcome or solution is to achieve that, and it's readily achievable if there is that cooperative mindset will there, is for the armistice to be supplemented by an agreement to end the war, which would be signed by the two Koreas, signed by the United States and China, and endorsed by the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter as necessary for the restoration and maintenance of international peace and security in Northeast Asia. A more ambitious approach to a peace treaty, which is very attractive, I think, if it could be delivered, has been proposed by Peter Hayes on this panel, by Mort Halperin here in this audience, by Chung In-moon, who you all know, and others, and that's for a comprehensive security settlement in Northeast Asia. And this would include not only a formal peace treaty of the kind that I've just mentioned, but some other things as well. Very clear associated declarations of non-hostility from the critical players, United States in particular, the ending of sanctions over time, the provision of economic and energy aid to North Korea, clearly, some kind of new, perhaps institutional arrangement for a six-party Security Council in the region, and a Northeast Asia nuclear weapons-free zone. And that's the second institutional change I want to particularly focus on, the desirability of it. A Northeast Asia nuclear weapons-free zone is an absolutely critical component of long-term peace and stability in the wider region. It would embrace both North and South Korea and Japan, and all the present nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, United States, China, and Russia, while not being required by such a weapons-free zone treaty to actually relinquish their own nuclear weapons, would, under such an arrangement, agree to abide by the treaty and in the process effectively protect a disarmed North Korea. They would give negative security assurances not to use or threaten nuclear weapons against non-nuclear armed states, including, of course, both Koreas and Japan. The non-nuclear weapon states themselves would undertake not to research, to develop, to test, to possess or to deploy nuclear weapons or allow them to be deployed on their territory. Within this framework, North Korea would have very clear obligations to freeze expansion in the first instance, to start to reverse and ultimately to dismantle its nuclear weapons, while accepting a very stringent monitoring regime. Protection would be given to South Korea and Japan by their having the right within a certain period to withdraw from the treaty if the denuclearization provisions were not being effectively implemented. So that combination of arrangements, I think, is something that is conceivable and really has to be delivered. The final institutional element that I would mention briefly is not as important on the face of it as the first two, but could be very important in the long run, and that is to give some real force and effect to the East Asian Summit as a regional dialogue vehicle for cooperation on security issues. Sub-regional security dialogue developments like the tripartite Japan, China, Korea, trilateral Northeast Asia Summit, which took place last year, that's very, very helpful to do that sort of stuff and should have a continuing role. But I think the really important thing to guarantee peace and security in the longer run in this region would be for the East Asia Summit to become the preeminent regional dialogue, policy-making, tension defusing body. Although it hasn't even begun to realize its full potential as an organization since it's assumed its present shape in 2011, the East Asian Summit really does have all the ingredients that you need. It has the participation of all the key players, it has the participation at national leadership level, not just ministerial level, and it has the jurisdiction to range broadly over both security and economic issues in the way that the existing arrangements don't. It has the United States and Russia as key players as well, which has to be the case. Some summits of this kind are sometimes parodied as insubstantial, ineffective, but they can be very important confidence builders, agenda setters, and critical players in guaranteeing a long-term peace. Just one final sentence or two on the subject of this. States and their leaders, if they're going to make, those who make a difference are of two kinds, those who are on the right side of history and those who are not. Those who make the right calls at critical, pivotal moments in national or world history, and those who don't. And I think the present generation of political leaders in this particular region, wider afield, are going to work have to work very, very hard if they are to be regarded by the next generation, represented so well in this forum, if they are going to be regarded as true visionaries. They're going to have to readjust their mindset towards a much more cooperative approach to international relations, and they are going to have to be prepared to sit down and make some really hard decisions about the practical institutional arrangements, the compromises that are going to have to be involved in translating that mindset into effective policy delivery.
Okay, Kenneth, thank you very much. You used a sort of first speaker's prerogative. You spoke. The full explanation, you need a lot of more time. But I have to say the rest of the speakers, we have to keep the timeline. Okay. And I will give you another, in the second round, you can have more time to speak. So let's keep to the 6 minutes rule. I'm sorry, you, from the second speaker, Peter Hayes, the director for Nautilus Institutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The broad elements of the Korean Peninsula denuclearization at this point are perfectly well understood. There is a roadmap. There are 3 broad elements: the freeze of key elements of military activity and nuclear activity by the United States and its allies and North Korea, respectively. That's already underway. The dismantlement of facilities in North Korea that relate to nuclear weapons, and then the disarmament of North Korea. In what sequence, what combination, what timelines? This is a matter of negotiation and implementation. I don't think it can take as little as 1 year per John Bolton, but I do think that the key and almost irreversible elements could be implemented in the North Korean side in 2 years, and then the full implementation over a 5 to 10 year time frame. And at Hanoi, we deadlocked over specifically the nuclear trade for sanctions. And I don't think that that's going to change quickly or easily as we move into what is almost inevitable, a third summit perhaps in the next 6 months. The implication of that deadlock is that the breakthrough that will lead to the fourth summit will come on the peace regime or security side of the negotiation between the United States and North Korea. In that regard, the implementation of what is termed operational arms control and confidence building in the inter-Korean Panmunjom Declaration is extraordinarily important. If that process proceeds and we begin to see the change in the conventional force structures and deployments that are so offensive and so risky by both sides, but especially by North Korea, then we start to get our hands on the underlying conflict that bring nuclear weapons into play in the first place. And in that regard, I think we can also see the early, almost invisible, but actually present, if you look carefully, steps whereby UN Command, in its relationship with South Korea and the other UN Command allies, begins an incremental process of communication, then cooperation, and then collaboration with North Korea, the North Korean military in particular, such that UN Command is no longer a partisan deterrent force where US Forces Korea is allied solely with South Korea against North Korea, whereby UN Command becomes a trilateral force engaged in reassuring both Koreas that neither side will attack the other. We can see some of the early first steps in this very important shift. It's very tentative, but I think that's what's actually going on, and this to me indicates that North Korea, which has cooperated in the early steps where UN Command has chaired the trilateral implementation groupings for the operational arms control inter-Korean agenda, I think indicates where we are heading. It's a fundamental change in the role of UN Command and US forces in Korea, one that probably would result in US forces Korea staying, not leaving, and that would have to be very carefully implemented to not upset the strategic apple cart from a Chinese and Russian perspective, but still critically important to advance, because if you can start to resolve the underlying conflict, the need for nuclear threat in either direction starts to reduce. However, even if this went very quickly, even if North Korea were to completely disarm very quickly its nuclear weapons, the Korean Peninsula does not exist in the middle of the ocean like New Zealand, surrounded by a gigantic moat. It's actually a very small place, very close to a number of nuclear weapon states that also happen to be great powers. And these great powers are in fact engaged in their own nuclear arms racing and modernization in this very region. Russia reintroducing strategic ballistic missile submarines into the Sea of Okhotsk and further afield, conducting long-range missile testing from the west of Russia to the Kamchatka Peninsula, deploying strategic bombers in the region, intermediate-range missiles in the region, anti-submarine warfare forces, and modernizing its nuclear command and control, communications and early warning systems in this region. The United States, as you all know, is forward deployed in many respects, with submarines operating in the Midwest Pacific and farther afield, with anti-submarine warfare, surface, submarine, and air forces in the region with the Allies, with the ballistic missile defense systems deployed, with testing of ICBMs from Vandenberg all the way to the West Pacific. And China, too, is from a very small base introducing its own modernization of nuclear forces. And we have a new, very complex interaction between these nuclear armed powers that is in many respects much more dangerous than anything that North Korea poses, except perhaps to Seoul. And so the nuclear weapon-free zone concept that was advanced by my colleague Gareth Evans is one way to get a handle on ameliorating and managing this nuclear threat between the great powers, and for that reason, I think is very important. And I'd also like to say to the students in the room, we have been trying now for generations to stop nuclear war and reduce the nuclear threat in this region. That baton is about to be passed to you, and you have an enormous and critically important role, particularly to learn from the Korean survivors of the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and to pass that very precious cultural heritage on, not only in your own society, but that is a global knowledge that we all need to keep very, very carefully in our hands. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your succinct presentation. You also raised some questions to be followed up. We can do it later. And then the next, Dr.
Thank you, Minister Song. It doesn't work, but you know, I'll go ahead without any PPT. No, that doesn't work. It doesn't work. Anyway, you know, we have speakers here, so I just wondered what kind of, you know, contribution, what will be the best contribution I can make here for your benefit. And so I am a North Korea specialist by training, and of course my specialty includes inter-Korean relations and North Korea-U.S. relations, nuclear and ballistic missile area as well. But our focus more on the credibility, so-called, the question of Kim Jong-un's promise to denuclearize. You know, this is, you know, basically a give and take deal. And if you do not, you know, trust the other side, and then this is worthless talking about, you know, negotiation and, you know, moving forward in denuclearization and peace settlement on the Korean Peninsula. So, and let me start by saying that you know, what we are trying to achieve in this great transformation in the Korean Peninsula. I personally used the expression great transformation in the Korean Peninsula. By that I mean, you know, the totally unprecedented new developments in the Korean Peninsula since early last year. So this is a, we could call it, you know, great transformation taking place in the Korean Peninsula. And let us recall what happened in 2017, particularly in the second half of that year. There was, you know, heightened threat of war. You know, not a simple threat of war, but it was, you know, threat of a nuclear war. Egregiously heightened threat of the nuclear war in the Korean Peninsula, and you know, the leaders of both the United States and North Korea just, you know, treated the nuclear weapons just like children's plaything. I have a nuclear button in my on the desk in my office. You know, that sort of, you know, totally unbelievable, unforgivable remarks by the leaders, political leaders. So we Koreans thought enough is enough, never again. So there was immediate consensus among Korean people that this, you know, something has to be done to you know, remove the recurrence of the of this phenomenon on a permanent basis. So we we decided to dismantle the Cold War structure and establish a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula as a cure for the root cause of the problem, the Korean problem, and also at the same time as a cure for key symptoms of the Korean problem. That's something we can have as a background of our effort to denuclearize and settle peace on the Korean Peninsula. Now, how credible is Kim Jong-un's promise to denuclearize? I think there is a lot of misleading by the press at the beginning. Simply, Kim Jong-un promised to denuclearize. He's committed to denuclearize, denuclearizing North Korea. But more correctly, he promised he promised a negotiated denuclearization of North Korea, not a simple, denuclearization of North Korea. So if it is a negotiation, we can all, understand how complex and how time-consuming it will be. So that's exactly what we're experiencing at the moment. And how credible Kim Jong-un is. He, of course, made promises to the heads of the state, not to one of the vice ministerial level people in the six-party talks, that he would completely denuclearize North Korea. And he made it very clear to Mike Pompeo as well when he first visited Pyongyang to confirm the veracity of the message delivered to Donald Trump by South Korean special envoy groups in March last year. And so he seems to be credible, at least at that level, publicly promising complete denuclearization of North Korea. But more fundamentally, I would share this analysis of mine with you. My analysis does not necessarily mean that he is totally credible or not. Everything is path dependent. This is a process we have between the negotiators, between the stakeholders, revisionists to our status quo, who are interested in dismantling the cold structure. It's already six minutes past. It's already 6 minutes past. Maybe.
In conclusion, it's time.
Yeah, maybe. I'm so sorry. Let me wrap it up by within 3 minutes. Okay.
Right.
Can I pass? Okay. In early 1990s, North Korea knew the Soviet was demising, and so there was a plenum of the Central Committee of the party in December 1991, which month was the exact month of Soviet demise, and they decided on two things. It's a give and take deal with the United States. Let's bring the United States into the strategic calculus, so that they can use it as a counterforce to China, and also using the negotiation with the United States to end the war, signing a peace treaty, normalize the relationship, and get economic help so that they can survive. And they wanted to give in return, because this is a give and take. There are two things. We will not develop nuclear weapons, and we will informally recognize the continuous stationing of U.S. forces in the South. So it was a give and take deal offer, and it was offered to Arnold Cantor, the ranking number 3 man in the State Department at the time. The next month, in January 1992. Famous, the well-known Kim Il-sung Arnold Cantor meeting. But the Americans did not accept that offer, because they thought that sooner or later North Korea will die, just like the Soviet Union and East Germany. So North Korea, in order to survive and develop, they wanted to carry out the decisions they made, which I describe as North Korea's strategy of survival and development for the 21st century. This is my own coined expression, and I'm kind of framework to analyze and explain what happened since the demise of Soviet Union in North Korea's policy. And they made 5 attempts to carry out the strategy. The second attempt was made in the first nuclear crisis, 1993 and 4, and third attempt was made in the second nuclear crisis, 2005, and fourth one was made in 2013, when United States publicly threatened the use of nuclear weapons against North Korea during the joint military exercise in March, April that year. And there was very close coordination between China and North Korea about how to deal with this situation. And on June that year, North Korea offered high-level talks with the United States to discuss denuclearization issue, but which was not accepted by Obama
Dr. Beck,
administration.
can you just now make a conclusion?
And let me close by saying this. What Kim Jong-un is trying to do from last year is the 5th attempt, if you put it in the context of North Korea's strategy of survival and development. So what I'm trying to say is that he is quite serious in my analysis. So if I have more time, I can say more about this credibility later.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I cannot give you some more time. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Shin-Kyuk from Stanford. You are going to use a PowerPoint?
Yeah, PowerPoint.
Is it
can you? No, it's not
is
mine.
is that yours?
No, it's not mine.
Who is doing?
So can you turn on my PowerPoint?
파워포인트 그쪽에서 하고 계세요?
So I checked already before, and there's always technical glitches. So
Yeah, I will deduct.
I checked before we start, and it was there. So
Let's do that. It's working?
okay. Okay, thank you. Given time limitation, I'm going to pose like a big picture questions for all of us, and then we can discuss more in the discussion. So here my main question is, what will be long-term prospects of peace on the Korean Peninsula? And I'm going to point out 4 possible scenarios, and then we can discuss more. Doesn't change. Can you go next one? Okay. So certainly there are many factors affecting peace on the Korean Peninsula. One is maybe rise of China, possible U.S. retreat from Asia. At least under Trump administration, there are signs of retreat from Asia by the United States. And certainly North Korean nuclear threat that we talked about, and also rise of nationalism in the region as a whole. But I think among those, I would say that there are 2 main factors that would affect peace prospects on the Korean Peninsula. One is, once again, tendency of U.S. retreat from Asia, and then North Korean nuclear threat. Okay, so I was trained as a sociologist. We love to develop 2x2 table typology. So here I think we can think about 2 possible scenarios for each case. One is whether North Korea will give up nuclear weapon or not. The second one, U.S.-ROK alliance. If not complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from South Korea, but at least significant reduction in change in the alliance. Okay, so the first scenario, which is mostly likely, is the status quo. So in other words, North Korea wouldn't give up nuclear weapon, and there are more skeptics than optimists that North Korea will give up its nuclear weapon. And also, it's likely that U.S.-Korea alliance will continue. So this is basically, presenting the status quo in the Korean Peninsula. And then there are many, topics that people may be discussing. One is about further strengthening U.S.-Korea alliance in dealing with North Korean threats. Or some people may say we better or more engage North Korea to ease tensions on the peninsula. But also third one, there might be more discussion about a strategic partnership between Japan and South Korea. I think this is a very important area that hasn't much getting attention in South Korea because, in a sense, South Korea and Japan, they share many common strategic interests. But nonetheless, their relationship has been really bad over the years. The second possible scenario is North Korea give up nuclear weapon, and also U.S. stays as troops in the Korean Peninsula. So the chance of this scenario may not be high, but still it's not unthinkable. In the case, probably U.S. and DPRK will normalize its relationship. And then maybe China may be a little unhappy because now North Korea is not anymore strategic value for China. And then China and maybe some other country, or even people within South Korea, may demand some modification in the alliance structure. So we might see modified alliance in this scenario. The third one, this is what the most Korean conservatives are worried about, and also some concern in Washington as well. Okay, North Korea doesn't give up. So it remains a de facto nuclear state. But then the United States significantly changes its position in South Korea, if not complete withdrawal of the troops. And I think among those possibilities, I expect that maybe South Korea may demand that it go to nuclear as well. So in 2017, when there's a growing military tension between U.S. and DPRK, I think a lot of South Korean people, according to public polls, they say that now we have to go nuclear as well. So in that case, maybe we might see nuclear South Korea that might trigger nuclear arms race in the whole region. So finally, North Korea removes its nuclear weapons, and then U.S. troops leave South Korea. So this might be most ideal situation, but also the least likely. But still, in this case, maybe North and South Korea may discuss a possible unification, and then two Koreas and China, Japan, they all think about creating a new Asian security structure, which is possibly multilateral. Okay, so this is more like a conceptual thinking that I like you to think about, and we should discuss because it may not happen tomorrow, but within 5-10 years, some of them actually may happen. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your very exact timing, first of all, and then succinct presentation. And now I would like to turn to Professor Yan Se-tung from Tsinghua University.
Thank you, Mr. Sun. Well, I have 6 minutes, so I will spend 80 minutes on one point. And first, I think the Northeast Asia have under the threat of nuclear weapons since the end of the World War II. And the nuclear weapons is nothing new to this region, right? And we even have the nuclear weapon used in this region. And so what it means? It means that today, the peace situation in this region actually is rests on the nuclear presence or existence in this region. And so you find that this region has enjoyed peace since 1991. And so the nuclear weapons there, and maybe have more weapons, nuclear weapons in the region, but the peace in this region and have never been broken out. Second is about the peace in East Asia. And there's two purposes in regarding about this issue. One is how to keep the present peace as long as possible. We call it a durable peace in this region. Second, how to improve the peaceful relationship among the nations. I think these are two things. And the physical peace means no war. And there's have been no war since 1991. And so how do we prevent war from occurring in this region? That's one issue. The second is called the peaceful relations. That means how to improve the relations, reduce the hostility among the nations in this region. So this is second point. It means that the first one is relatively easy, and the second one is really difficult. So when we're talking about denuclearization, from my understanding, it's not talking about how to keep war from occurring, but talking about how to improve the relationship. And third is about how to improve the relationship and among all the major powers in this region. First, we have to understand that. And the countries beyond this region, they have no any concern about North Korean nuclear issues. And you can hardly expect it. The Europeans are talking about, give a serious discussion about international security, about North Korea's nuclear issue. And even if you have a meeting for the ASEAN countries, that's a part of the East Asia, just Southeast Asia, and they seldomly care about the nuclear issues in Northeast Asia. So what it means? It means that if we consider how to improve the relationship among the East Asian countries, we have to rely on ourselves. We cannot rely on the international community. We can only rely on the countries in this region. Generally speaking, in this region, we have to say, and the country related with this issue, North Korea's nuclear weapon, and actually it's the U.S., South Korea, China, and Russia, Japan. The other countries, from my understanding, have almost no any substantial relationship with this issue. Among all of these 6 countries, who are crucial? That means what's the dialogue? And between any of them will make sense. And in the last year, we noted that the six-party talk actually didn't achieve anything on this issue. But then the bilateral talk between the North Korea and the U.S. and make some progress, although it's not that desirable, but it's making progress. So from my understanding, the negotiation between the U.S. and the South Korea is crucial. And if there's no talk between these 2 countries, no matter what talks we have among the other 5 countries, it cannot make any progress. So if that's true, so what approach we should adopt from my understanding? And at this moment, seems to me, the bilateral approach is more efficient than multilateral dialogue. So come to this fixed point here that who we should encourage to talk as early as possible and carry out the substantial discussion, they are U.S. and North Korea. Unfortunately, the dialogue stopped after the Hanoi summit. And so then the final point is that what's the role the South Korea can play in this? And we must remember in this region, and the only country have any country have the substantial impact on this issue relatively equal to the U.S. influence is South Korea. I don't think other countries have that kind of impact on South Korea denuclearization as South Korea. So why? Because you're allies of the United States. You can have the impact not on North Koreans. You have impact on the United States. So how the South Korea encouraged the U.S. to resume the dialogue with North Korea is the current issue. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Yan. Well, now I like to pose some ensuing questions on the reverse order, just starting with Professor Yan, and then this question might be applying to Professor Shin and Dr. Beck together. Well, before going to that, just an ensuing question to Professor Yan is that you are right that South Korean government should take some firm position of its own in the negotiation of the Hanoi. But with that in mind, let me ask you a question. Do you think you think the Korean people are somewhat less fearful and have less sense of threat of North Korean weapons, and the North Korean nuclear weapon is now becoming some a fact of life on the peninsula? So my question is, do you think the South and North Korea can peacefully coexist while North Korea keeps on its nuclear weapon option? And then I think this question goes to Director Beck, and as well as Professor Shin, because you also floated an idea of a status quo. Yes comes to the status quo. So let me hear from the three of you of that question with just 2 minutes maximum.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, that really depends. How do we define the term of peaceful relationship or peaceful coexistence? From my understanding, there's no war between the South Korea and North Korea since 1953. And after the war, there's no another war between the two countries. So physically, I call that the peace. Second, if we define the peaceful relationship, means the friendship, definitely there's no substantial friendship between these two countries. How can you make these two countries a friendship? Just now we have the photos and have the leaders of the two nations meet together. And the question is that how can we maintain that kind of a contact? If both sides cannot maintain this contact, a normal contact between these countries, I doubt there's no way to improve the relationship from the current situation to a desirable level.
So for me, as far as North Korea maintains nuclear weapon, I think any peace on the Korean Peninsula will be unstable. So think about North Korea threatening with nuclear bombs, and right now certainly U.S. provides some nuclear umbrella, but then how long you can really trust the United States, right? That's why I mentioned that South Korea may argue that they should go nuclear as well. So if you remember, Cold War, between U.S. and Soviet Union, actually, they maintained peace, ironically, by both countries keeping nuclear bombs. So based on what we call mutual destruction. So if one attacks the other, then it kills everybody. So that's why I think it's important that we continue to engage North Korea so that it can dismantle nuclear program and bombs. But if they don't, I think South Korea has to face a very difficult question. What you're going to do, you're just going to live under very unstable peace with American nuclear umbrella, or is South Korea going to go nuclear by itself? Of course, it's not easy because there will be a lot of international pressure. But this sooner or later, in my view, South Korea has to confront this very difficult but fundamental question, assuming that North Korea won't give up its nuclear weapon.
Thank you very much. And Professor Beck, even though Sejong Institute is not under the government administration, but here, in Korea now, people, particularly in the present government, and then there is a sense that North Korean nuclear weapon is not directly targeting at South Korea, and they will not be using the weapon against South Korea. That kind of mood is somewhat not prevailing, but there are. How do you think the South Korean people will just be complacent with nuclear-armed North Korea and having some exchanges and cooperation with the North Korea? Is that two trends, two track possible?
Whether North Korea uses nuclear weapons against South Korea or not, it's not a matter of contention in terms of whether we can coexist with North Korea, nuclear North Korea. We are a divided nation, and we are in a fierce competition for monopolizing governing authority of the whole Korean peninsula on each other's form between North Korea and South Korea, and regardless of whether they potentially use it against us or not, we cannot peacefully coexist with North Korea as long as they possess nuclear weapons. For instance, if there is a multilateral, we can think of another situation. For instance, if there is a multilateral control mechanism over North Korea's nuclear weapons, then we might be a little relieved, but that does not necessarily, give us a real, sense of security because we are a divided nation. And also the huge impact of nuclear weapons on security areas as well. Let me answer your second question. Can we do exchanges and cooperation with nuclear North Korea? In the process of making our efforts to denuclearize North Korea, we can do it. But if it is clear enough that North Korea will not denuclearize itself, and our effort to denuclearize, South Korea's effort and joint effort of the international community proved to be a failure, and then I think there inevitably has to a certain period of pause, at least, to think about the next step, next direction. People of South Koreans at that point will have to decide whether to continue do exchanges and cooperation with the North, under what conditions. My personal note here, as an academic, I have been advocating denuclearization of North Korea as something we have to do, absolutely, all through my academic career, because I thought a nuclear North Korea will be a real serious, impediment to, Korean unification. If North Korea possesses nuclear weapons, and then it may not be very easy, not easy for us to promote national unification. So I personally always wanted to make some meaningful contribution to national unification. So from that point of view, I personally also cannot accept nuclear North Korea.
In this regard, Gerard, you have something to say?
Yeah. Look, I'm just a little bit troubled I'm a little bit troubled by the implication, particularly in what Professor Yan said and Professor Shin said, is that there is something credible about the notion of a nuclear balance, that it has contributed to stabilizing the peace since 1991, and that it might be a credible option for South Korea to contemplate if North Korea refuses to denuclearize. For goodness sake, let's come to grips with the reality that mutual possession of nuclear weapons is not a guarantee that we won't have a nuclear holocaust at some time in the future, not so much through a deliberate use of weapons by either side, but through human error, system error, miscalculation, or just, misuse. I mean, we've learnt, have we not, from all the Cold War archives that are being opened about the number of times we came close to nuclear horror during the Cold War period of mutually assured destruction and mutual deterrence because of command and control problems and possible system error and human error. We know that, and with the new arrival of cyber technology, cyber sabotage, all the miscommunication issues that can flow from that, the chances of us going on, without a nuclear catastrophe, if both sides of any given contest have nuclear weapons, are really minimal. I think it's sheer dumb luck that we've survived as long as we have in the world of nuclear weapons without a catastrophe occurring. And I think we do have to recognise that we have to put all our eggs in the basket of trying to avoid such a situation developing, and have to recognise the reality that if North Korea doesn't need nuclear weapons to protect itself. It's got deterrent capability with a ring of rocket fire around Seoul. It's got deterrent capability against any kind of enterprise to, going that way. And the notion of North Korea using nuclear weapons against the South or anybody else for the indefinitely foreseeable future is just, to me, inconceivable. To be homicidal would be to be suicidal, just because of the capability, the defense capability, the retaliatory capability of the United States, of South Korea, of Japan. North Korea would be turned into a car park if it used the nuclear weapons that it has. So let's get off the anxiety about the use and move seriously towards a discussion of trust building, which will remove nuclear weapons on both sides. And let's edge down the path of thinking that it's a credible option to acquire nuclear weapons as a way of deterrence in an environment where North Korea keeps them.
Okay, Garrett. Well, regardless of the North Korea's use of nuclear weapon against South or others, problem might be the threat perception. That would be the main source of concern.
Yep.
So how, in this regard, Peter, how do you think about this threat perception from the nuclear weapon states? And Professor Shin, you have something to talk about this? Yes, after this, yeah, please.
Well, threat perception is not a strictly rational process. There are many factors that affect the perception of a threat from an adversary. In the Korean context, it's heavily weighted with history. It's overladen with the division of Korea into, it's as if the American Civil War never ended. The two sides have this extraordinary commitment. Well, it's not extraordinary, but they have this absolute commitment to contesting the sovereignty of the other side to the same territory in the long run. So this is a very deep, visceral, underlying conflict. And many of the parties to this conflict truly have amnesia. They've forgotten the origins of the conflict, what has already happened, as if their adversary would forget it. So, threat perception is not a rational process. That said, we can say a few things about the use of nuclear threat between the United States and North Korea in the last 20 years. First and foremost, the use of nuclear threat by North Korea has not been to deter South Korean or American attack. The first reason I say that is that there is very little evidence, in spite of the hot rhetoric in 2013 and 2014, for the entire period from 1991 to today that the United States and South Korea ever intended to attack North Korea. The North Koreans know perfectly well there are roughly 10 indicators of what would have to be done simultaneously to mount an attack on North Korea. And we have been very careful on the American side and also on the South Korean side to make sure that those 10 indicators, roughly, have never lined up at the same time. And the North Koreans are just as capable of reading that data as we are. The second important fact about the North Korean perception of American nuclear threat is that they perceive American nuclear threat not as deterring them from attacking the United States, but as compelling them to change their policies towards the United States. They view this as coercion, as compellence, not as deterrence. And in the other direction, we have been using compellence, not deterrence threats against North Korea from fear that North Korea would attack, to force the North Koreans to stop doing what they're already doing. Not to stop them from starting a war, but to stop them from proliferating nuclear weapons. This is a mutual compellence game, not a deterrence game. And when you're trying to compel people to change what they're already doing, the psychology of forcing people to change already existing behavior and habits and commitments that they've already made is completely different to deterrence.
Okay.
So this is a very dangerous game. That's why the nuclear threat game is so dangerous in Korea. And it's not about stability at all. It creates enormous instability in the relationships.
Thank you. Professor Shin, you have something to add on?
I mean, you know, I agree that it's a dangerous game, and also we have to remember that it's not only perception. I think we have to understand that there's a real threat. It's not just a perception of something else. And we know that North Korea continues to develop weapons of mass destruction even while negotiating with the United States. So there's no sign that North Korea will stop developing. So if they continue to do, and what is South Korea to do? I mean, once again, we should engage North Korea as much as possible. We should try to persuade, maybe help North Korea to give up. But what if not, right? I mean, if I talk to experts, probably only a handful of experts believe that North Korea will give up. I don't know how many of you really believe that North Korea will give up nuclear weapons. So, like a couple of weeks ago, I was in Washington and talking to officials in the government. So my overall impression was that I think American officials are also a little now confused. On the one hand, they wanted to bring back North Koreans to the table. So how to bring back to the table. But also some people really questioning whether the approach that they have taken over the last couple of years is the right one. Okay, so should they really continue? Do you really believe that North Korea will give up if we continue to do that? So, even within the United States, there are some, I think, debate inside. And I think in South Korea we should debate. If we have nuclear-free North Korea, that's great. But if not, then what are you going to do? I mean, we just can't assume that everything will be fine. So, well, I'm living in the United States, so maybe I should, that's worry about. But I think that's a big question.
Thank you very much. My question is directed to Professor Yan Shetong in continuation of this discussion. As I said at the beginning, there is a lot of talk about the new nuclear balance in Northeast Asia. When it is, as Professor Shin mentioned, it is real threat, something more than threat perception. And with that in mind, when South Korea and Japan probably there is some claims that we have to have nuclear weapons, then this area will go into sort of nuclear arms race. And the Chinese government has been saying that the Asian security is by Asians. So China has a strong stakeholder of this security of the region. So if we fail, I think we are not succeeding in denuclearizing North Korean peninsula at this moment, and no good prospect, no end in sight. So if this nuclear proliferation move is more materialized with regard to how China would encounter, I mean, that to face this move, Chinese position is just let them do? Is that, or Americans will stop Japan and South Korea from getting weapon? Is that Chinese view? So let me hear something from your point of view.
Well, first I have to say I'm just a scholar. I cannot represent my government.
Sure.
Okay, that's my personal view. I think the Chinese government at this moment, they want to encourage the U.S. and South Korea to resume their dialogue. They believe the negotiation between the two countries can achieve something positive. Second, I think this, when we're talking about denuclearization in Korean Peninsula, actually mainly refers to North Korea to denuclearize their own weapons, not talking the others. That means no one said that, okay, the denuclearization means abolish all of the weapons of the China, US, Russia possess, right? That means refer to the dismantle the weapons of the North Korea possessed. And so now we have come to the question, in what condition North Korea will like this idea to give up their nuclear weapons? Only two conditions. First is that they are forced to. They have no other choice. Second, they are willing to, for some interests they think is more important than the nuclear weapons. So at this moment, I cannot any of these conditions exist. I don't think any country, even the collective efforts of all over the world, cannot force Korea to abandon its weapons. Second, I don't think anything is, in the North Korea's eye, anything is more important, it's a bigger interest than possessing nuclear weapons. So if neither of these can come into being, how can we looking for the denuclearization of North Korea? So the same thing come to this arms race. And from understanding, and I personally, I do not worry about the possibility and South Korea and North Korea to develop their own nuclear weapons, so they have a nuclear arms race in this region. The reason is that North Korea and Japan so rational. They also make the same decision according to their interests. They do the strategic calculation, and which one is more beneficial to their own countries. Possess nuclear weapons or enjoy America's nuclear umbrella. So the same thing, like the North Korea. All of these three countries will make decisions according to their rationality. So my understanding, I don't think North Korea and Japan possess nuclear weapons will be more reliable than America's nuclear umbrella. So if these possess nuclear weapons exactly the same, but more expensive than America's umbrella, why South Korea and Japan
but
develop
Americans,
their own
as
weapons?
it was said, Americans made to
question.
have sort of, you have a question?
Yeah, for him. So what about then China provides nuclear umbrella for North Korea?
You want me to answer that question?
Yes, please.
Because I mean, that may be an interesting idea because now U.S. provides a nuclear umbrella to South Korea and Japan, and in return for giving up North Korea, nuclear weapons, what about China provides nuclear umbrella?
First,
to
China.
North Korea?
Okay. First, China regarded providing nuclear umbrella as a kind of proliferation of a nuclear threat. So China opposed any kind of nuclear proliferation. So China said China will not provide nuclear umbrella for any country, right? That's first one. Second, come to this very concrete issue. China's nuclear policy is no first use. If we provide nuclear weapons for any country, and then we must change our doctrine. That means if that country involved with any country, and then we have to use nuclear weapons to attack the country who do not attack the China. That means we violate our own principle, no first use of nuclear weapons. So these two things, both the principle and the concrete policy, and prohibit China from providing nuclear weapons for any country.
Okay, Garrett, you have something to add on this? If you can, just a moment. In this connection, you can...
Just one more point.
Yeah.
We know objectively that nuclear weapons are very imperfect modes of deterrence. We know objectively that nuclear weapons are very imperfect modes of compellence. We know that nuclear weapons, by their very existence, are extremely dangerous because of the possibility of them being misused, if not deliberately, and with that possibility heightened by the new cyber technology that's out there. Knowing all these things as we do, it's absolutely crazy for anyone to be considering adding to the nuclear contest environment. We should be focusing all our resources on ways of getting away from reliance on nuclear weapons from those countries who are presently psychologically dependent on them, but not objectively dependent on them. So that gets me back to the original point. What it's all about is bringing a mindset to this, which is focused on trust-building cooperation and building institutional arrangements which will give the countries involved some confidence that they will in fact be protected. Combine that with North Korea's own deterrent conventional capability and all the other factors that are at work, which will work towards stabilizing, I think you can get to a situation where North Korea, treated properly by the other countries, could be confident in its regime security, confident in its longevity, and as a result willing to give nuclear weapons up. But the more talk there is of other players getting into the game and bludgeoning North Korea into submission by countervailing force of a nuclear kind, the less likely it is that North Korea will succumb to that. It's just crazy to think about nuclear weapons as any useful part of the ongoing, sustainable, peaceful future.
Okay, before we open the discussion to the floor, just let me touch on the so-called nuclear weapon-free zone in this discussion. I think United States, in particular, is not enthusiastic about this idea of nuclear weapon-free zone. But Garrett and probably Peter, you just floated this nuclear weapon-free zone idea in Northeast Asia. If other countries are positive to that idea, how do you think the United States, I'm going to ask Professor Shin and Peter, how the American government would react to that idea?
I mean, the concept itself wonderful, but we are having so much difficulty in persuading North Korea to give up nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. And then how can you talk about nuclear-free zone? Even when we have such a difficult time in talking to North Korea about nuclear weapons. So it's a great idea, but I'm not sure how realistic or feasible.
Okay, Peter, you do have some.
Well, I always am amazed when I hear statements that nothing is more important to North Korea or Kim Jong-un than nuclear weapons, when he's already declared that other things are as important, if not important, as he did in the New Year's speech this year, saying that the welfare of the people is as important as nuclear weapons. It's no longer a military-first, nuclear-first policy. He's already made that decision. He's already declared to his own population his intention to get rid of nuclear weapons, not keep them forever, but under the right conditions get rid of them. This is an absolute statement by the leader of North Korea, not a relative statement. And in that sense, he can't put that cat back in the bag. He's got to continue to go down that path and continue to negotiate for as long as it takes. Now, there are different ways that you can create a nuclear weapons-free zone to implement that strategy. One is an inter-Korean zone, which would just be a larger version of the 1992 denuclearization declaration, only more specific and wider, with a wider scope. And the fundamental problem with such a version of a nuclear weapon-free zone is precisely the contested sovereignty of the two sides. It is not a treaty that would be binding in an enduring sense. It's not an international treaty. And in particular, it would only give a negative security assurance on the ending of nuclear threat or the use of nuclear weapons to one party in Korea, which is to the North Koreans. What I think would be symmetrical and fair is that South Korea get the same reciprocal commitment from at least China and Russia. And the only way to do that is to have a regional nuclear weapon-free zone that would leave the door open to Japan, possibly Mongolia. Even the nuclear weapon states could join. And very few Americans know, let alone Koreans or Japanese or Chinese colleagues, that the United States is not only party as a nuclear weapons state to many nuclear weapon-free zones around the world, including South Pacific nuclear weapon-free zone, where nuclear extended deterrence continues to operate as we speak. So that's not really an issue. But the United States itself has territory which is covered by a nuclear weapon-free zone, specifically Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands in the United States are actually covered by the Latin American nuclear weapon-free zone, and the US military is not free to deploy station nuclear weapons in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands, in the United States today. So it is a political choice as to what configuration a nuclear weapon-free zone should take. But if you want to get out of the inter-Korean legal political struggle over reunification, get into a binding legal framework which has reciprocal and symmetrical commitments from all the states in the region and enables North Korea as a nuclear weapon-free state to become party to the treaty at the outset, committing itself to come into full compliance over time, thereby giving us a legal basis to hold their feet to the fire until they've disarmed and can come back into the NPT as a fully certified non-nuclear weapons state, you have to go with a regional nuclear weapon-free zone treaty. There is no other framework in which you could do that. And in that sense, we can see the future right in front of us. It's just a question of how long it takes and how convoluted how complicated the process is and how tortuous the pathway to get there. But it is where we'll end up, whether it's in our lifetime or in the student's lifetime.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, because of my inability to manage time, we have about 10 minutes. And now I would like to open the discussion to the floor. And when you have a question, raise hand and just tell whom are you asking the question. The first, and then on the back hand, you second. First and the second, yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Max Nurnes. I'm a lecturer at Seoul National University here in Korea. Several of you have touched upon the fact that in the last 2 or 3 years we've seen events in South-North relations that we wouldn't have expected 5 years ago, I suppose. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the people in power, to the occupants of the Blue House and the White House. If we look 5 years into the future, I think it is realistic to imagine that other people might be in charge. Do you think it's fair to say that we're facing a closing window of opportunity for progress in this regard? Because in a few years, the constellation of those who make decisions might be so different again that progress might just not be feasible anymore?
Whom are you asking that question?
Pretty much everyone.
Anybody? Direct back, you too?
You know, we have an experience already that you know, election and the leadership change, and government change, policy changes will make things differently. You know, totally sometimes undesirable way from the perspectives who does not like the policy the new policies they have. They witness, but I think we are in a great transformation. At the outset of my presentation, things have changed a lot. There is nobody who want to go back to the time of second half of 2017, 2 years ago, for instance, when there was an egregiously heightened threat of a war, nuclear war. So,
anybody else? Well,
Look, I do think you have to grab the moment in international relations. You have a moment here with President Moon in South Korea, who is bringing exactly, I think, the right mindset to this. Build trust, step by step, confidence building. You have in the White House someone who is completely unreliable, has no intellectual grasp of the issues, has no moral compass, but actually did the right thing in initiating the summit in exactly the same way that a stopped clock can be right twice a day. Maybe it was complete chance that he did the right thing, but he did the right thing, and so we ought to grab the moment. Because my worry is that with each passing year that goes by without this issue being resolved, the prospect of some terrible miscalculation or misjudgment being made will become ever more real. So, rather than waiting for some new environment to come, I mean, President Obama didn't contribute anything at all to the resolution of the North Korea problem, with all the decent instincts that he obviously had and all his understanding about the horror of nuclear weapons. It was just a sort of a steady-as-you-go situation. So grab the moment, by all means.
I can add on that, to reach an agreement, it may take a couple of years or even few months you can reach an agreement. But in implementing the agreed upon things, it would take, to my judgment, more than decades. But during these decades, changes of government in each capitals make all these equations different from the time of the agreement. And we have witnessed this kind of things for last 20, almost 30 years. So that is the reason why some people espouse a multilateral approach bound by or participating countries. But unfortunately, at this time, this multilateralism is not the fashion. Already established multilateral arrangement is broken down by the President Trump. So with that in mind, we are not that much sanguine about the future, but still we have to probe. Having said that, behind you raised hand, you still going to ask a question?
You want me to ask a question now?
To whom are you going to?
I want to ask a question to Mr. Peter Hayes. So
Peter Hayes?
can I briefly introduce myself? I'm a grade 8 student at NLCS Jeju. I want to ask a question to Mr. Peter Hayes. When you said that Kim Jong-un said that his people's welfare are on equal importance level as nuclear arm to his nation. But I really want to ask you, if South Korea or any other nation refuse to aid North Korea because of his nuclear weapon, like why are they still doing it? This certainly means that he doesn't really care about that. And according to what Mr. Evans said, Kim Jong-un is a very irrational person. What he said and what he does change almost constantly. What are your thoughts on this matter?
I think there's really no evidence that Kim Jong-un is an irrational person or erratic or a immature strategic persona, as you might put it. He's actually been remarkably consistent since he took power. He's consolidated power in an absolutely brutal fashion, but he has succeeded in that consolidation, and he continues to wield power in an absolute manner to ensure the complete loyalty of the elite in North Korea in a way that I find distressing and repulsive from a Western liberal humanitarian kind of value set, but I'm not sitting in North Korea facing the external and domestic constraints that he does, sitting at the top of that pyramid of power. If your question is, will he trade off the welfare of ordinary North Koreans for maintaining a nuclear weapons capacity and a strong military until he forces his adversaries to adjust their positions and reduce the external constraints on the ability to grow the domestic economy, the short answer is yes, he will do exactly that for as long as it takes. And it's silly and even counterproductive to pretend otherwise. All you do is create more punishment, more pain for average North Koreans, and you reinforce the very behaviors of the super elite and Kim Jong-un himself that you're trying to change. It's a very counterproductive strategy. We predicted 2 years ago that even extraordinary sanctions on the energy imports to North Korea would have little or no impact on the nuclear weapons program, on the North Korean military's capacity to wage war, and on the lifestyle of the super elite. And with 2 years now of experience, we have been proven precisely correct. They have continued to do exactly what they feel they needed to do. But what has happened is ordinary North Koreans now have to push buses around with people inside rather than actually riding the buses. That's the kind of pain that's been inflicted on ordinary North Koreans through these kinds of sanctions. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I don't think that Kim Jong-un is an irrational adversary at all. In fact, I would prefer to have a Kim Jong-un in power with his knowledge of the external world, his multilinguality, and his desire to bring about change for reasons of political survival of his family and the kin extended network and the North Korean system than his father, because his father, I think, did have certain irrational ways of ruling North Korea that were much more damaging and much more limiting than Kim Jong-un. We're in a better position having Kim Jong-un as an adversary than we were having Kim Jong-il.
30 seconds?
Yeah, sort of, one in this session, we have discussed some hypothetical situation. For instance, what if North Korea uses nuclear weapons against the South? What if North Korea decides not to give up its nuclear weapons? But I think those, hypothetical end state is the indication or outcome of our failed negotiation and our failed policy. So what is important to engage continuously, unwavering fashion, North Korea, engaging North Korea, so that we can just tie North Korea to our initiatives for peace and denuclearization, so that we can have a new era for hope.
Okay, I'm sorry that we could not continue our discussion from here. But one thing I would like to say is that the security equation on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia changed drastically since 1917. Since 2017, when North Korea declared and was proved it has a deployable nuclear weapon. I would say that it is something like a post-Lapsarian. We entered into a sort of a post-Lapsarian era. Before North Korea's nuclear weapon and after nuclear weapon is totally different world. With that in mind, when we have been saying this language, the denuclearization, so many times, but we still did not go into, South and North and United States into the clear definition of what this denuclearization means. When you do not agree on the definition of a concept, you can hardly reach an agreement. Under this situation, still, if we on one track denuclearization, the other track the peace process, peace regime, and to make them not in parallel but in tandem move is so difficult. So I would say that today's discussion, just we found that it is so difficult to reach. But still we need this kind of intellectual endeavor to have some more convergence of views. Thank you very much for all the experts' knowledgeable panels and active participation from the floor. I would like to end today's discussion here. Thank you very much.